Hello and welcome to the Minnesota Homeland Security and Emergency Management's online training course, Emergency Classification Levels. Working closely with Xcel Energy, FEMA, and local units of government, the state of Minnesota has developed detailed emergency plans that address actions to be taken to protect the health and safety of the public surrounding both Monticello and Prairie Island nuclear generating plants. These plans are practiced routinely with oversight from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The purpose of this training is to explain how an emergency at a nuclear power plant is classified and what actions are taken by off-site organizations at each classification level. There are 4 emergency classification levels, each having its own level of response. The classification levels are listed here in order of increasing severity. First is a notification of unusual event. Next is the alert, then a site area emergency, and finally, a general emergency. A notification of unusual event is a low-level event, which poses no threat to public safety, but which warrants an increased awareness on the part of plant and off-site agency personnel. No release of radiation requiring an off-site response is expected. An alert is also a low-level condition which poses no threat to public safety, but for which precautionary mobilization of certain response functions is appropriate in case conditions degrade. Small amounts of radioactive material could be released, but would be only inside the plant, and any release is expected to be only a small fraction of the Environmental Protection Agency's protective action guidelines for exposure levels. For a site area emergency, conditions have degraded to a point warranting the full activation of response functions. Small amounts of radioactive material could be released into the atmosphere near the plant, but these are not expected to exceed the Environmental Protection Agency's protective action guidelines for exposure levels beyond the site boundary. However, precautionary protective actions for high-risk portions of the general public might be recommended. At a general emergency, conditions have degraded to a point threatening public safety, for which some form of protective actions will be initiated. Radioactive releases may exceed the Environmental Protection Agency's protective action guidelines beyond the site boundary, and protective actions based on actual or projected data may be required for those people living and working within the 10-mile emergency planning zone surrounding the plant. During radiological emergency preparedness drills and exercises, we usually begin at one of the lower ECLs, such as the alert, and move progressively through the ECLs until we have completed all of our actions through the general emergency. We do this in order to demonstrate all of our plans and procedures for each emergency classification level. However, in the unlikely event of an actual emergency at a nuclear power plant, there would not necessarily be a steady progression from one ECL to the next. In fact, historically speaking, when an ECL has been declared by a nuclear power plant, the emergency usually begins and ends with the same ECL. The remainder of this training will go into greater detail as to what actions are taken by off-site response organizations at each of the emergency classification levels just discussed. The following actions will be taken if a notification of unusual event is declared by either Prairie Island or the Monticello nuclear generating plant. Even though a notification of unusual event is a low-level event which poses no threat to public safety, it does require that off-site agency personnel be made aware of the situation. Therefore, if an NUE is declared at Prairie Island, both Minnesota and Wisconsin would be notified, as would the Prairie Island Indian community and the risk counties of Goodhue and Dakota in Minnesota and Pierce County in Wisconsin. If it were declared in Monticello, then Minnesota would be notified, along with Wright and Sherburne counties.
Following this notification, there would be a partial activation of the planning section in the State Emergency Operations Center, where the state and the utility would initiate communications about technical issues. Details about the current plant conditions, the possibility of escalation, and other important information would be collected and passed along to stakeholders. This situation would then be monitored until the event is terminated.
The following actions will be taken if an alert is declared by either Prairie Island or the Monticello nuclear generating plant. even though an alert emergency classification level is also a low-level condition which poses no threat to public safety. Precautionary mobilization of certain response functions needs to occur in case conditions degrade. For this reason, the governor signs and issues a predetermined emergency executive order activating the State Emergency Operations Center and portions of the National Guard. At this time, county emergency operations centers will also activate. In the case of Monticello, it will be Wright and Sherburne counties, and in the case of Prairie Island, Goodhue and Dakota counties would activate in Minnesota, and Pierce County would activate in Wisconsin.
Emergency worker decon sites are placed on standby. For problems with Monticello, these would include the Zimmerman Fire Department in Sherburne County and the Rockford Fire Department in Wright County. Or for issues at Prairie Island, it would be the Hastings Fire Department in Dakota County, the Red Wing Fire Department in Goodhue County, and the Cannon Falls Fire Department also in Goodhue County. Reception centers are also placed on standby at the alert emergency classification level. For issues at the Monticello plant, the reception centers include Princeton High School in Mille Lacs County, the Rogers High School in Hennepin County, and Apollo High School at St. Cloud. Or if problems were to occur at the Prairie Island nuclear generating plant, the reception centers include Park High School in Cottage Grove and Wabasha High School in Wabasha County. The SEOC also recommends to counties that school districts within the 10-mile emergency planning zone be notified to have buses placed on standby in case the situation worsens and evacuations become necessary.
At the alert emergency classification level, Target is notified to discontinue the distribution of potassium iodide from Target pharmacies. The reason for this is because if conditions at the plant degrade to the point where protective actions such as evacuations are required to protect the public, it is in everyone's best interest to follow these instructions rather than wasting time lining up at Target pharmacies. The following actions will be taken if a site area emergency is declared by either Prairie Island or the Monticello nuclear generating plant. At this classification level, events at the nuclear power plant are much more serious, and a full activation of response functions begin to occur, and precautionary protective actions for high-risk portions of the general public will be reviewed and possibly recommended. At the site area emergency, the governor issues a predetermined declaration of a state of emergency. The declaration authorizes the use of state agencies and resources to assist in the affected areas. The declaration is a precautionary measure and is necessary for any formal requests of assistance to be made to the federal government should conditions become even more serious. The State Emergency Operations Center now recommends to counties that have school districts inside the 10-mile EPZ to relocate the children to their designated sister schools located outside the 10-mile EPZ. And all schools bordering the 10-mile emergency planning zone are notified not to send children home who live within the 10-mile emergency planning zone. Reception centers are also set up and staffed to receive and monitor evacuees in case protective actions become necessary. Also, congregate care centers managed by the Red Cross are activated near the reception centers. At the site area emergency, preparations are made to evacuate or shelter in place special populations should the need arise. These would include jails and prisons, nursing homes, dependent care facilities, daycares, and government facilities such as emergency operations and dispatch centers. Also, rail and river traffic is suspended within the 10-mile emergency planning zone. This includes the North Star commuter rail line around the Monticello plant. The following actions will be taken if a general emergency is declared by either the Prairie Island or the Monticello nuclear generating plant. Remember, this is the highest of the 4 emergency classification levels, which means that conditions have now degraded to a point where public safety is threatened and some protective actions will be initiated. When a general emergency is declared by a nuclear power plant, it means that a release of nuclear material is either occurring or is likely to occur. Therefore, protective actions are implemented to protect the public and emergency workers. These include evacuating the public or having them shelter in place. In combination with this, as a secondary protective action, the use of potassium iodide is approved for the general public and emergency workers. The population that is evacuated or sheltered in place is based on plume projections and computer models that take into account the amount of radiation that is or may be released, wind speed, and wind direction. Live media briefings are initiated to push out the evacuation or shelter messages, and special news bulletins are released to the media. As protective action decisions are implemented, necessary traffic and access control points are set up and staffed to facilitate evacuee traffic flow and to restrict re-entry into the evacuated area. These traffic control points are located at the border of the evacuated area. Each road that crosses into it would, at least initially, require staffing by either the sheriff's office or the state patrol. Eventually, as the incident progresses and barricades are put in place, at least some of this burden could be transferred to the National Guard. As people leave the evacuated areas surrounding either the Monticello or Prairie Island nuclear generating plants, they would be directed to one of 5 reception centers. If evacuating from around Monticello, the general public would go to either the Princeton Reception Center in Mille Lacs County, the Rogers Reception Center in Hennepin County, or Apollo High School in St. Cloud. If evacuating from around Prairie Island, they would be directed to either the Cottage Grove Reception Center in Washington County or the Wabasha Reception Center in Wabasha County. At the reception center, people in their vehicles can be monitored for radioactive contamination, and if contamination is found, people in their vehicles can be deconned as necessary. If there is a release, the Department of Agriculture will set up an agricultural control area for all counties 50 miles downwind of the nuclear power plant. This means that food or food products can only be moved through special permitting. The Department of Agriculture will coordinate the permitting and movement of agricultural products in the control zone based on available data. In addition, the DNR will issue recommendations on hunting, fishing, and recreational land use. As unlikely as a release at a nuclear power plant is, recent events have shown us that we must not be complacent and that we need to be prepared if the unthinkable happens. This training has outlined a partial list of basic actions that would be taken based on the severity of an emergency at a nuclear power plant. For more detailed information about the actions taken at each emergency classification level and the Radiological Emergency Preparedness Program, please review the fact sheets and other documents on our website at hsem.dps.mn.gov.